Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Rationally Speaking with myself, Stuart Carrington, and Martin Turner. How are you, Martin?
All good, thanks, Stu. Hi everybody, welcome back. I think we just need to do a little bit of housekeeping first, don't we, Stu? We've not been telling people to like and subscribe and make comments and generally engage. And I think it generally helps the kind of YouTube algorithm if you do that. So if you are inclined and you like the stuff that we're doing, please subscribe, please like the video, please check out the other videos and do the same for those. And feel free to make comments what you think about what we're covering and maybe what we could even cover in the future.
Yeah, I think that last point is kind of one thing I wanted to really emphasize to people is this, we see REBT everywhere, and I think we want to share sort of like what we can gather from REBT and put it into kind of more accessible media as well. So hopefully that's one thing we're going to do today. Actually, I'm really excited about today because I'm a massive Karate Kid fan, and today this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about Karate Kid and Cobra Kai.
Nice, two things that I'm not so familiar with. I know the old Karate Kid stuff, the first couple of movies maybe, but yeah, I don't know the other stuff. So this will be an education for me on two levels.
You're missing out. You're missing out, and I'm not on like Netflix commission or anything like that. But check out Cobra Kai. It's awesome.
Okay, so what we'll do then is we'll kind of share some slides. You can talk us through, and then we'll have a discussion as we go.
Cool.
Great. So hopefully everybody can see the slides and take us away, Stu.
Perfect. So as you'll see on ahead of you, we've got this character, one of the main characters in the original films to Karate Kid. Now, not like the title character, who was played by Ralph Macchio. We're going to talk about his character in a moment. We're going to look at the Karate Kid from another perspective, which is where the spin-off show Cobra Kai kind of picks up. And this is on the character of Johnny Lawrence, who in the original film, you may remember, he kind of played the bully, if you like. And what we want to do is we want to explore this character who in the first film is very different to how we see him in Cobra Kai. And he has this wonderful arc, this wonderful like kind of redemption arc. And we're going to explore that character, but using an REBT perspective. So if we can move on, and here we go. We'll tell you a little bit about Johnny Lawrence. So this is Johnny Lawrence in the first film. So he's kind of like in this scene, he actually gets sort of labelled a degenerate. And he kind of corrects his friends and says, like, I'm going to sort it out this time. Now, I'm in my final year at school. I'm going to get my life and get my sort of like pieces together. I'm going to make it work. He wants to make something of himself. So we see in this character, this person that's sort of very much like kind of craving a little bit of respect. He's very much wanting to be a somebody. And he's very much wanting to show everyone that he's not worthless, that he can really achieve something. And he does that like with his friends, and he does that by kind of being like the all-star karate champion in the Valley in the original films. And consequently, he's seen or portrayed a little bit like the cocky bully, if you like. Now, what we find out in the later films is that he's kind of a little bit troubled. So his dad's not present. His mum's married a very kind of rich guy who's like, hence why he's got all the cool bikes and the cool gear and things like that. But his attitude at the moment is very much kind of this, I need attention and I want attention and I want to be seen as kind of like the top dog, if you like. And this isn't actually kind of helping him get what he wants, which is respect from other people. And in this very first scene, the introduction scene that we see him in the Karate Kid, is where he sees his old girlfriend, played by Elizabeth Shue, and she's talking to Ralph Macchio's character, Daniel LaRusso, and he doesn't like it. And he's kind of chatting to her, and she doesn't want to know him because she just sees him as a bully. And he can't get his head around that. He really wants this respect, and he kind of keeps talking about this, needs to be respected and listened to, and she doesn't want it. So I guess here, just want to get your thoughts, Martin, on this, like this notion of demands and this notion of like, I want something, and then how it can make us act in a way that means that we don't get it. And I guess that's the definition of irrational in this sense.
Yeah, well, it's that desperation, isn't it? It's that need, that must that often leads to behaviours that actually make it less likely that we get the thing that we demand. Whereas, as we know with REBT, you're kind of better placed to desire those things, because those things might make sense for you as a person. It might make sense that you want to be accepted, you want the attention of others. That's a normal thing to desire. But when you go about it in a demanding way, it might lead to behaviours that make it less likely to happen. That kind of desperation comes through. And I think that's quite easy to happen when you really, really, really want something so intensely, it can kind of slip into a demand and can actually not help us. So it's kind of paradoxical. And as Stu there said, that's where the irrationality sometimes comes from there.
Like in this wonderful scene here, like he actually talks about this word like degenerate. Like I think one of his friends sort of jokingly sort of like uses this word in a couple of the episodes in Cobra Kai called X degenerate and then one called Ace degenerate. And you kind of have this image of this person that's saying, oh, I want to sort my life out, I'm going to make it work, I think is the exact quote. And then scenes later, he's getting into fights, he's doing drugs in school, not paying attention to kind of like lectures or skiving off classes and things like that. So like I think that essence of what someone says isn't always a great window into what they actually believe.
Yeah, but I think that, the idea that your behaviour can kind of betray what you say you believe. And I think we've used that example before, haven't we, Stu? If I say to you, I believe the exit to this room is through the window, and then when I get up, I leave through the door. I've told you what I believe through my actions. Now, that obviously doesn't always work, because people can, believe things and act in a completely different way for various social, political, all sorts of reasons to do that. But I think when we're working with people, that's some of the questioning that we're asking is, okay, you believe these things, but how are you acting? So is the person you're working with acting in a way that they find something completely intolerable and the end of the world, even though they might say, but that's not what's going through my head when I'm in that moment. Yes, but you're acting in that way. You're behaving in a way that this is the worst thing could possibly happen. This is completely intolerable, So I think that kind of transition between belief and behaviour is quite an interesting one, because not everybody has that insight into what they believe or can necessarily articulate what they believe. It might not be accessible to them, but what they believe sometimes bleeds through into their behaviour, and that gives you a window into what the individual believes at a deep kind of tacit level that might not be easily explained, or it might not be explicit. And that's why it's always surprising when you're working with people, when you start to, with the client, reveal these things, and the client start that self-discovery process of saying, actually, this is what I really deeply believe, and I've believed it for many years. I've just never articulated it in this way. And they're surprised that this has happened, but it makes sense to them. You can see that moment when it happens. In the literature, we sometimes call it like the light bulb moment. Like they go, oh, okay, that's what I've been doing. And that's really partly through behaviour, understanding behaviour, observing behaviour, having them report behaviour gives you that insight into the beliefs sometimes.
And what you've done there, Martin, is sort of like really identified this, like the mediating effect of beliefs. So beliefs will kind of directly influence our behaviours, but then likewise, it goes in the other direction. From our behaviours, we get an insight into what our beliefs are. And it's interesting that that's come up now, because the next slide we're going to talk about where Johnny's beliefs may have been created or reinforced.
Well, also just to add to that, the behaviour can obviously shape the belief as well. It's reciprocal. Take avoidance, for example. If my response to what I perceive to be threatening situations might be a social situation, I might be socially anxious and I'm going to a party or something, and I have the choice to avoid it, and I do take that choice and avoid it, my avoidance behaviour then reinforces and builds upon my belief that being at a party, being nervous would be intolerable. I couldn't stand it, and everybody would laugh at me, and so that makes me an idiot. You avoiding actually strengthens that belief. So it's reciprocal, it's cyclical, and then because you believe it, it makes the next time you go into a situation like that a bit more difficult, which makes you more likely to avoid. And if you avoid it, then reinforces. So this reciprocal, cyclical relationships between beliefs and behaviours, I think, is quite significant in the lives of human beings, but also obviously when we're working with people. That's the bits and pieces that you need to unpick to really understand what's going on and how to help somebody. And then also, as Ellis would do, sometimes fashion a behavioural intervention as sometimes a first port of call before you really get to the beliefs and start disputing irrationality and generating rational beliefs. Actually, we can structure behavioural interventions to move that along more quickly. In REBT, we have something called shame attacking. Maybe people have heard about exercises where individuals are encouraged to go out there and really, really put their ego on the line as a behavioural assignment. And they might have to sing on a street corner. They might have to walk a banana on a string through the mall or something. To put yourself in a situation to behaviourally challenge yourself, to break that cycle of avoidance, and then we circle back to the belief. So because of that behaviour belief link, it means those behavioural assignments can be quite powerful and quite immediate, actually.
So we've got beliefs, behaviours, emotional consequences, but they're all interdependent and they can work both ways and reinforce each other.
100%.
Okay. So let's have a look at maybe where Johnny's beliefs have been reinforced or kind of originated from. And here's the significant other and in Johnny's life. And throughout the film, I have to say more so in the Cobra Kai series, the kind of father figure in Johnny's life is his sensei, John Kreese here. So Vietnam vet John Kreese, who embodies Cobra Kai's motto of strike first, strike hard, no mercy. And this is a kind of theme that it sort of just permeates through the whole films and all these series. And John Kreese is very much an individual that kind of embodies those values. He believes that kind of showing any type of weakness is wrong. And that one should never show any type of weakness or compassion or mercy. He believes that violence is the answer to most problems. And he believes that you should and have to not show fear, not show pain, and not show mercy. So we have these demands that he even reinforces in a drill in the dojo of his students when he says, it must not exist in this dojo. Does it? And then everyone shouts no, and so on and so forth. So here we've got this kind of socialization of beliefs. And I was wondering if you could share with us some of the research around how irrational beliefs are socialized in individuals.
Yeah, so this was something that I think Ellis was kind of cognizant of, the idea that beliefs could be shaped by the society that you're in and the culture that you're in. And because of that, it means we can help people and socialize them out of irrationality through education, through our surroundings. And this has kind of led to a piece of work that somebody called Ryan Bailey is leading. Ryan Bailey's a full-time psychologist, just coming to the end of his PhD with me. This idea of irrational climates. So yes, you have your own individual personal beliefs, but they don't form in a vacuum. They form on the basis of your parenting, school, upbringing, the environment that you're surrounded by. Within sport, we have this idea of climates, kind of the performance environment that you're in, and that can sort of deeply shape what we think, the rules that we create about our sporting environment. Now, if as an impressionable, a young athlete, the coaches that you come across, your teammates, the organisations that you're involved in, and your parents are endorsing of irrationality, so must win, must not show fear. If you show fear, you're weak. Failure is intolerable. Making a mistake is the end of the world. If they are endorsing of those, then what you do is you pick up those signals. You pick up the signals from the climate and you start to internalize those as rules or beliefs, as these kind of tacit ideas. And those rules or beliefs help guide, how you interact with the sporting environment. And also, once those beliefs are in place, you're probably more likely to spot those signals because they kind of align with what you also believe. So you get a bit of confirmation bias there too, or attentional bias towards the things that align with your own personal beliefs. So having somebody who's a father figure, as you said, becomes extremely important, both positively and negatively, because as you can imagine, if you have a significant other, teammate, parents, organization, which is, say, rational or giving off rational signals that, yes, we want to succeed, but it's not the end of the world to fail, and we can tolerate it and move on and learn. When you fail, it just shows that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. It doesn't mean you're a complete failure. If the environment, the climate has those signals, then the individual within that climate, the young athlete, quite typically, because they are more open to taking on these ideas, then they'll develop more rational ideas about their sport, about their performance, and therefore, protect their well-being and approach sport appropriately rather than inappropriately with all this, kind of irrational pressure. So, people are leading this work into these areas, and it provides us with an opportunity to work with people within those organizations to help to shape that climate from an REBT lens in more of a rational way, as opposed to an irrational way.
Now, I want to ask you a question here, Martin. I want to kind of sow the seed for something that we're going to discuss in a little bit, because I have a slide to kind of address this a little bit more. But perhaps what someone that's listening to this might be thinking is, okay, well, like in this situation, like Johnny is a two-time champion, and he's like the best fighter in the dojo. He's doing really well. And Kreese himself in the films and in Cobra Kai is talking about how he's like the best fighter he's ever had. And he's instilling these values that like first place is everything. If you don't win, you're a loser. You mustn't show fear, mustn't show pain, all these things. What might you say if someone's saying, well, it's working? Like, this is a good thing because look at the benefits that this guy's reaping from the coach's teachings.
Well, I think that benefits when you're working with somebody and we're applying REBT, we have to think about function as something that is for the human being, not just for the role or the context. So it's helping me to win fights, okay? But what is it taking away from you as a person? Because we know that this character socially isn't so great. He's become a bully. He's not attracting the people that he wants to attract. So he's paying the price for some of these beliefs and behaviours. And we have to do an analysis of whether it's worth it. What price are you paying for success in this context? And becoming this person, can you constrain it to the context, or is it affecting your entire identity? At which point it gets precarious and dangerous, So I think that to somebody who says, yes, but this is working, it's helping me win. But it's like, okay, well, what's the cost, and is the cost worth it? Is that price worth paying your entire identity?
And that price is something that Johnny pays tenfold later on, and we're going to reveal that as we move on. But here we've spoken about perhaps kind of the sort of the negative socialization. And if we move on to the next slide, what we're going to see is perhaps some sort of what we'd call positive sort of socialization.
Well, just before we move on, just thinking as you were speaking there, the idea of a significant other in film, in media, and literature is often a reflection of ourselves. So all of us have got this kind of sensei part of our minds, which is very rule-based, very rigid, very dogmatic, can be very negative, and you can use that to help you with things, and it's a part of all of us, and in some ways we have to utilize it and integrate it into who we are. So that's part of us all, and we have to figure out what to do with that. How do we exercise it? How do we use it? How do we stop it from taking over and really driving our behaviours? We've got to mediate that. We have to mediate that side of us. So I think we often see that in films. We have a specific character that plays a specific role that is driving some of that dogma, some of that rigidity. But really, the metaphor is, well, that's you. That's inside of us all, and I think it's what makes these characters so powerful. Is we hate them on one hand, but we also relate to them on the other, because there's part of us that's like that.
Oh, you've just set up the next one perfectly, Martin. Let's talk about Daniel LaRusso. So Ralph Macchio's character, he's the title character in the Karate Kid. What I like about this character, and I know I'm coming across like a fanboy now, but I am, so I have no shame there, is that he's very nuanced. It's not like he's all good. So there are times in the first film where he lets himself down. So he has a hot temper, for instance. He can't stop like biting at Johnny's bait occasionally, and so on and so forth. And so his teacher, his sensei, Mr. Miyagi, and Mr. Miyagi is very forgiving. He's very accepting of Daniel as a person. He understands that Daniel is a fallible human being, like we all are. He even understands his own, Mr. Miyagi, I'm talking about now, his own kind of limitations and flaws, and other people's limitations and flaws. He's very forgiving, for instance. Like at one point, he even says there's no such thing as a bad student, only a bad teacher, for example. So don't be too harsh on these individuals that are perhaps being socialized or led astray or hold these beliefs. So I guess a couple of things we can talk about here. The first is we can see how significant others can socialize us in a negative way, but also perhaps in a positive way by reinforcing rational thinking. But then additionally, I guess we want to touch upon this notion of acceptance. And Ellis was keen to promote universal self-acceptance, or USA, but he also spoke about universal other acceptance and universal situation acceptance.
Yeah, well, I think Ellis was, I wouldn't say he got there first, but he was one of the very early proponents of acceptance. Now, acceptance can mean other things. Obviously, we have acceptance commitment therapy, and there are other modes and forms of acceptance. But Ellis's acceptance isn't like a passive, like, oh, well, that's a shame, it didn't work out, or oh, well, that's me, then I'm just a fallible human being, so I'll never succeed at anything. Ellis's acceptance and REBT's acceptance, as it's been refined over the years, is more like active acknowledgement of reality. It's like, okay, that's happened. That's now a solid, real experience. So what's my next behavior? What's my next choice? How do we move on from this? How do we take what has happened and grow and learn? So that it's kind of acceptance, because it's changed. Other forms of therapy have taken on that word. Acceptance in REBT means something different to those other modes of therapy. It means something different to the dictionary definition of acceptance. This is about saying, I actively acknowledge that I'm a normal human being. Whatever a human being is, I'm just one of those. I'm going to succeed. I'm going to fail. I'm going to do good stuff. I'm going to do bad stuff. But I can never be wholly good or wholly bad, or complete failure or complete success, or. So it's just that kind of balance that REBT offers, even within that idea of acceptance. You have to see it as a nuanced, balanced. I wouldn't say to process, but it's just an idea that you have about yourself that's more nuanced and balanced and is based in reality, rather than I'm 100% this or 100% that. Yeah.
And interestingly, like in the film, particularly in the original film, Daniel's teacher will talk about balance quite extensively. We have a quote later on where balance is mentioned, for instance. But also there are kind of these signs that we can pick up in the film that shows that Mr. Miyagi doesn't believe in this kind of global self-evaluation that you just said. If I fail at something, it might be tempting to think, well, now I am a failure. But that's not necessarily true. And likewise, if we succeed at something, it doesn't mean that I am now a success. That's just something that has occurred, and I can accept that sometimes I win and sometimes I lose and sometimes I do well and sometimes I don't. So, for instance, like Mr. Miyagi doesn't have his war medals on show. Even though oh, you should have these like on display. And he's like, yeah, it's like, that's just something that happened to me. Likewise, when bad things happen, it's okay, that wasn't nice. I didn't like it very much, but I'll move on and I'll try to learn from that. And I guess this is this difference, or this nuanced difference between kind of acceptance in a passive way and then what we might call active acceptance.
Active acceptance, yeah. And also it's where it links a bit to self-efficacy. If you define yourself as a complete failure, then how can you go into the next situation with any confidence? Because you're bound to fail, because you've defined yourself as a complete failure.
Yeah.
Then on the reverse of that, if you don't do that, then it opens you up to being able to succeed in the future, and to put the apparatus around that to make it happen, to learn things, to change things. If you define yourself as complete success, then it's like, well, okay, no learning needed. So either position is seen as suboptimal. If it feels positive to say I'm a success, but it's suboptimal. Feels very negative to say I'm a complete failure. It's suboptimal. No, each of those extremes is not the best way to go about things. That's REBT's position. It makes sense. It's sensible, isn't it? This isn't. Hopefully, to people listening, this hopefully shouldn't sound like a crazy idea.
Yeah, I also like that. Again, if we can go back to these films, we see kind of like signs where Miyagi is showing that, well, we might not like these situations, but we can kind of actively choose something about them. There's a wonderful line in the third film where Daniel's saying like he's scared, like he actually doesn't want to fight an opponent because he's feeling fear, and Miyagi says to him like, it's okay to lose the fight, but you mustn't lose to fear. Like, so we can accept that this is scary, that might be fearful, but don't let the outcome like define you. Like sort of that process would be much more important than just defining yourself on winning or losing. And I guess this is like a message that this particular sensei is teaching. And what we're going to see now is this in the next couple of slides is you mentioned this precarious position. And what happens if we lose balance? We're going to see that shortly with Johnny in particular. So this is the end. This is the sort of the climactic scene of the first film. So this is after the tournament that concludes Karate Kid #1, and Daniel has beaten Johnny in the final. And
spoiler alert for.
I mean, the film's like 35 years old, mate. Like, if you haven't seen it, like, I'm not taking any responsibility for this. So we have, okay. Johnny's lost, guys. So sorry about that. And here we have his sensei, and he's got him in a neck lock, chokehold, whatever. And interestingly, the line that's said before this is they're arguing in the car park, like of the sports center, right? And Kreese, the sensei, the bad sensei, he's snapped Johnny's trophy over his knee, and Johnny's like, "I bought you second place." Now, obviously, he's won the previous 2 years, and he's like, "What's your problem?" And Kreese says to him, "It's second place. You're nothing. You're worthless. You're a loser." And like that's like the exact quote. And then Johnny kind of reacts emotionally to this, understandably, I guess, and says, "You're the loser, man." So then this is what instigates this. Now, Miyagi and Daniel could easily just walk away because these are kind of like the antagonists of the film. It's like, well, these people have been really nasty to me. Like this is their problem. Just let them deal with it. And Miyagi goes over and sort of says, "Just let the boy go now." And then there's like a fight. Miyagi ends up like winning that kind of altercation in a very peaceful way. But I guess our point here is this word like you're nothing, you're a loser. And this goes back to that global evaluation that you were talking earlier on. Like he's lost one fight. Even on that day, he's won more because he's got to the final. But because he lost the final, he's a loser. And I guess what we want to talk about how harmful that global evaluation is.
Well, yeah, it's so final and so total, you see, and it doesn't leave any wiggle room for learning or growth. It's like, that's you now. That's your identity. You're worthless. You're a failure.
It's definitive.
It's definitive. And as we said a little bit earlier, links to self-efficacy. Well, how can I mount the confidence and the courage to approach other challenging situations if I'm coming from a position of, well, I'm a failure, and therefore I probably won't be successful at things. When obviously in reality you'll succeed and fail. The idea would be, if you want to be, be successful in a particular career, would be that you succeed when it really matters, or try to succeed more than you fail. But the idea that you wouldn't fail is obviously rubbish, and therefore failure is just a kind of a sign of your humanness and the unpredictability and uncontrollability of the environment. Now, REBT and myself are very careful of catchphrases like failure is feedback, fall forward, You often hear that as well.
Mm.
You can think about it however you want, but ultimately, failure is just a signal that you're human. Humans fail.
Mm.
We succeed as well. We succeed as well. And the reason success is valuable and important is because we're fallible, because we're limited as human beings, and because the environment is uncontrollable and unpredictable and dangerous. It makes our success more impressive and more valuable, in the same way as choosing to do something good is valuable because there's always the bad option. So, it's that counterbalance really of the two that you need. But the idea that you'd be 100% one thing, it kind of limits our behaviour, it limits how we go forward into new things, limits our learning, limits our reflective capacity to actually look back and say, okay, well, I could change a few things, because it's just final. It's just so totalistic.
And that notion there, limiting, like you've mentioned this word, precarious, these are things that I think we're going to see manifest themselves in Johnny quite extensively as we see how his life progresses following this event.
Well, I think, as well, just to add there, Stu, the data tell us some interesting things about global evaluation as well. It's the belief that seems to be most highly linked to symptoms of depression. You can imagine if you're telling yourself all the time that you're worthless and you're a failure and you're an idiot, then that's going to start to deflate you quite significantly. We're going to start to get down, and that's going to get worse as we spiral. And it shapes our behaviour. So then we start to restrict ourselves, withdraw ourselves, therefore reinforcing the fact that we're worthless and we're failures. So you're then down, you're down into a nasty spiral. But this scene that you're talking about, this idea, it's like a nice culmination for a film, for example. But I always thought in this it would have been interesting if the antagonist, if he'd have won. Because that sometimes happens, It's like that person that is rigid and extreme and brutal to an extent. Sometimes they do come out on top. And obviously we're talking about a successful athlete here too, who has won many things. But again, it's like, okay, what's the cost? That person's won this trophy, but they're paying the price usually in other ways. And they might seem like a big deal within this context, but actually they haven't managed their lives in lots of ways because those beliefs did not transact into life very well. The extreme, dogmatic, rigid belief systems, they don't really work for life. They might work in this very specific context, and there's an argument around that. I'm not saying they do or work or don't work. They might work. But they don't really transact to life. They're not useful things for people in terms of approaching life as a human being.
I mean, now you've really set up the next slide. You're going to like this one. Here's Johnny at not the beginning of Cobra Kai, but it kind of is, because this isn't one of the later episodes, but they flash back to kind of maybe what he was like at the beginning, where it's Cobra Kai kind of is a spin-off series that is taking place. I'm going to get the timelines perhaps a little bit wrong here, but maybe like 40 years after the events of the first film. Now, we see like two very different characters. So Daniel LaRusso, Ralph Macchio's character, he's very successful. He's happily married. He's got 2 kids. He owns a car dealership that's doing very well. He lives in the rich part of California, where Johnny used to live, incidentally. And Johnny's situation has reversed, and he's a drunk. He's doing kind of menial jobs. He's trying his best to make ends meet. He's in an apartment. He's frequently late with his rent. He's out of shape. And in this scene, it shows him going to his mother's grave. And then he breaks down and he cries. And he says, "All it took to destroy me was someone to call me a loser." And it was that definitive statement of like, so you lost, now therefore you are nothing. And as a result of that karate tournament, that, like you just said, it didn't transact very well in his life. Those beliefs didn't help him. His self-efficacy, his resourcefulness, his appraisal of himself was completely eradicated by that definitive statement. And I guess this is what you're saying when okay, well, it might work in this particular context, but at what cost? And this is the cost.
Yes, Stu, and I think that's really important. It's kind of one of the trickier conversations that we can have with people, I think, because it's like, well, there's this belief that I have, and it's leading to suffering potentially. Like, I'm anxious and I'm angry and I'm down at times, but I'm successful in my sport, my job, or whatever it is. I'm actually doing all right. But we have a responsibility, I believe, to think about Ellis's notion of long-term hedonism, long-range hedonism. Maybe hedonism isn't even the right term, but there is obviously Epicureanism in REBT as well as Stoicism. But to me, it's like long-term fulfillment and contentment. So is what you're believing and how you're functioning now and the rules that you're creating for yourself, is that useful and applicable across the different aspects of your life over the long term? Now, it's hard to predict, isn't it? Hard to predict how we develop beliefs now, whether they're going to be useful for the long term or not, which is why RBT gives us a nice structure around rationality and rational beliefs and living our lives with a logical, scientific mindset that has an eye on, okay, we'll make sure this is sustainable in the long term. And I think that's a tricky conversation to have, because it's like, well, the person could say, the client could say, yeah, but this belief is helping me in this context now. It's actually driving my performance and helping to do that. My comeback to that, not that you need a comeback, but my how I would lead conversation through that is to focus on the long term and to help the individual to see themselves as more than just an athlete. That is part of your identity, but it's not your entire identity. That's the first part for me. The second part is, well, as a performer, surely the idea is to develop your competence to the extent that you can go into a performance situation, regardless of what you believe, and still perform well. Shouldn't it be to develop my skills to the point where I can execute them under pressure in a range of situations, regardless of these kind of internal ways that I'm directing myself? So why does it take a must for you to perform well? And I kind of steal the Ken REBT idea. I really love this question that he used to ask athletes. I've modified it slightly, so I'm not going to say this verbatim as he used to, but it's like, how bad an athlete are you that you need everything around you to be perfect for you to perform well? You can modify that to, how bad an athlete are you that you need to do and tell yourself very specific things for you to perform well. Actually, as we know, when we observe sport, sometimes it's about getting the win somehow and coming away from this idea of perfect, the idea that things should be a certain way for me to fulfill my potential. And I think as soon as I've helped athletes to loosen some of that and to come away from this very rigid and dogmatic notion of things must be the way I like them to, or else I won't fulfill my potential, they understand that actually, sometimes, quite often actually, the best approach is to be pretty free and easy and just rely on your competence and try to do things instinctively. Now, I'm talking about very competent athletes here, professional athletes, elite athletes. Maybe it's different for sub-elite. I'm not so sure. But, it's a bit of a waffle, but I suppose I'm trying to get to grips with sometimes how we lead or direct or take part in a conversation where an individual is saying, yes, this belief is rigid and demanding and very extreme, but it's helping me here. It's like, okay, but I think our job is broader than that. I think we've got to introduce balance and nuance and critical thought, and not just say, oh, well, if it's useful for this specific context, then always believe this forever. It's like, well, as we can see here with this example, you try to transact that belief into your life, and things tend not to work out because those beliefs by nature are not suited to nuance, because they're not nuanced. And life is nuanced, so we better have beliefs that match life.
Do you know, I think sometimes as well, when we see athletes say, well, this is helping me, I've always perceived that as an athlete might see it as like good or bad. So there's only kind of like two options, whereas really it's a scale. And it's like, well, this might be helping you to this extent, but actually perhaps thinking more rationally, you might be even better. You might succeed even more if you were to think slightly differently. You sort of like put this cap on yourself. So, for instance, in the Karate Kid films, Johnny loses that final because he's too aggressive at the end, because he's taught, like, I must not show fear, I must always strike first, and so on and so forth. So
you can see him like lose that emotional control, can't you, in the film?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, he just loses all emotional control. And then, incidentally, in Cobra Kai, and this is where are going to be some spoilers, but I'm going to be a bit more careful about them. He actually succeeds more when he appreciates the balance and actually tempers himself sometimes. So sometimes it's a good thing to kind of have that aggression, and then sometimes it's not. And you have to kind of embrace both and have that balance and flexibility. And REBT as an approach is flexible in nature.
Yeah, and it's one of the RBT is one of the ways we can approach the idea of cognitive mediation. So you're mediating between the environment and your emotions through how you believe and how you think. So yes, aggression sometimes suits the situation and is a requirement for success, let's say. But also it could cause problems and isn't the right solution, isn't the right approach. So you have a stimulus, you have an activating event or adversity, as we call it in RBT, which is, say, a confrontation. You don't automatically respond in a super aggressive, violent way. You try to cognitively mediate it. You try to slow things down and try to see the situation for what it is, gain some perspective, try to mediate that so that the emotion is what it needs to be in that environment to get the best outcome. That doesn't mean you have to roll over and be passive. It might mean that you've got to be assertive and there isn't an element of aggression there, but it doesn't spill over into something that's going to cause problems and makes the situation worse. So it's that kind of in that moment, in that kind of final fight, you're kind of thinking, what is the cognitive mediator there? Well, the cognitive mediator is probably, I must not lose, must not show weakness. If I lose this, I'll be a complete failure and I'll be embarrassed and nobody will like me. Failure is intolerable. You can imagine that kind of cognitive mediation taking place, maybe not explicitly, but it's been so trained into this athlete that it's just happening at an automatic level now. It's just running through the default process. And then he's kind of coming out in that behaviour, in that emotion. Whereas what we're trying to teach people is in those moments, try to champion the rational and try to stay balanced and understand how to use that emotion for something that's actually functional and useful in that context.
Perfect. I couldn't put it better myself, Martin.
I think you could. I think you could say it better and shorter.
Let's move on. Now, here's a slight spoiler. So in Cobra Kai, this is Johnny's son. Now, in the beginning of Cobra Kai, he's got a bit of a kind of tumultuous relationship with his son. But then they make up and their relationship is much healthier towards the end. And in the final tournament, his son gets injured and can't compete anymore. And in this particular scene, what instantly made me think of REBT, and I guess this is the purpose of these podcasts, is to show how Martin and I will watch a film or listen to a song or see an athlete do a talk, give some testimony, and we see elements of REBT come out in them. And I was watching this scene, and Johnny is like comforting his son, and he's like, I'm so sorry you don't get to kind of compete, and you had a chance to win. And his son says, karate has given me my dad back. He's met his girlfriend. He's like, I've made really good friends doing it. It's given me confidence. He's like, that looks like a win to me. And so I guess and then Johnny says, you're taking this so much better than I would have done at your age. So there's two things there. One, it's about how we can often let one event define us. So in this instance, his son, Robbie, might have let that sort of failure or kind of negative, the adversity, because he's got a really bad injury, like define him. And he hasn't let him do that. He's looking at the entire situation. Now, that doesn't mean he's happy about the situation. He's particularly upset that he's injured. And so, well, this was a bad thing. I don't like it. But this one thing doesn't have to define my experience. There's lots and lots of this. So we can talk about that in a moment, and I'd love to talk about the I task around this as well.
Yeah, sure.
And then the other part is when Johnny says, "You're taking this so much better than I would have done at my age." And this is because Robbie has been exposed to Daniel's kind of teachings, if you like, where he's talking about balance, and he's talking about emotional regulation and about not losing control, which is kind of a theme of that particular school of thought. And so perhaps it's, well, yeah, because I've actually been, my eyes have been open to this sort of different way of thinking that you never had when you were a kid. And so we see this wonderful sort of growth in Johnny because he's kind of learning from his son and learning off his former rival. And we see it manifested in his son. So there you go. There's me talking for a long time. What do you think
That's
about
good,
that,
mate.
Mike?
That's interesting. I think so. The thing that immediately popped into my head was kind of the breaking of the cycle, the passing on of irrationality is broken, you know, and I think that can happen when the teacher, in this case the parent, has had kind of a revelatory experience where things haven't worked out, and they're reflecting, and they can pass on the good stuff and pass on the lessons to their children, the people they're teaching, people they're coaching. And I think it's good. It's a nice, a nice aspect of this scene of breaking that cycle. And I think that often what we see, particularly within sport and kind of the sport culture, the passing on of these ideas that are fundamentally irrational, and how those ideas propagate. And it's, well, my favorite coach taught me like this, or my parent taught me like this, or I teach like that. But within that, potentially you're passing on the bad stuff, and just because it works for you for a little bit might not work for the next person. And it snowballs, and then what people do is they extract the most powerful pieces and double down on those pieces and add their own, and you end up with this purer version of irrationality that's very potent and very powerful. And when I've entered into some systems, it made complete sense to me why the system itself, why the climate itself could be defined as irrational or perfectionistic, or not very, it's quite controlling, not autonomy supportive, because these ideas have just been passed on through generations, have just been built upon and refined and distilled down into this very kind of powerful but very pervasive and negative, shared idea of what sport is and what performance is. And you see the outcomes of that in some examples you could find in the media of particularly organisations that got a particularly poor climate. And then, just leading on to your point around nuance and balance, to me, when I read REBT, I think Stoicism, I think some Epicureanism, I think of the cognitive revolution of the 50s and 60s. That's what springs to mind. But obviously, Ellis was informed by Eastern philosophy as well. And I think that's what's interesting about this film and this series and your example here. It helps us to understand that there is a root of REBT in Eastern philosophy, to the extent that it can speak to Eastern philosophy just as comfortably as it can speak to Stoicism, that we consider European philosophy of a certain time. And I think that's important because I think it sometimes gets forgotten. And, those influences were, I think, really important into the makeup of not only REBT, but the cognitive behavioural therapies generally, and probably more so now than ever before. Now we're into kind of the third wave with ACT and the idea of mindfulness. So, this idea of nuance and balance really comes through here and kind of does remind me of those roots of REBT and how we shouldn't forget them.
Perfect. Now, I mentioned that, what a great summary there, Martin. I think that aspect of like kind of Eastern philosophy is really important. And one thing that I really wanted to share with the readers, I guess, is how Ellis would. This isn't just something that sort of like came to be. REBT is an iterative process, and it was developed through years and years of contemplation and challenge and attempts to falsify that thinking. Is what I'm saying correct? Is this helpful? And actually challenging and trying to falsify that approach. So it's been refined over many years. And I guess the clues from, like you mentioned there, Stoicism and Epicureanism and Eastern philosophy, like they're there, and Ellis is kind of taking parts and then challenging them and then refining them over decades.
Yeah, it's trying to amalgamate good ideas that have seen people through tough times over the ages, and trying to put them into a structure, a framework, a toolkit that people can use in their modern lives, and use language that fits with the modern world. But he's taking these the good ancient ideas, that seem to fit and seem to work. And I think lots of psychotherapies are able to do that. REBT is very explicit in its use of that, which is why we can connect the dots so easily to Stoicism, to Epicureanism, to Eastern philosophy, because they're so explicit in there. That any casual reading starts to make that stuff pretty obvious.
And then we see a modern situation in the slide ahead of us where someone's experienced a particularly negative event and is dealing with it. I just wanted to talk very quickly. I mentioned the I task. When we talk about like one event defining us, one activity, and REBT is quite useful in providing practical activities for individuals to do. So with the I task, the participant might draw two large letter I's, as in me and I, and within one eye, they might write down perhaps like negative events that have happened. And then in the other eye, they might write down the positive events that have happened, to show that not one negative event might define me. So just because I lost or got injured or something like this, that doesn't define who I am. That's just part of that eye. And then likewise, there's lots of positive eyes, and they don't define me either. They were just part of what I am and my experiences.
Well, the way I would use that is I would just have one big eye.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's only one you. There's only one you. There's only one self, and the good and the bad exists within that big eye. And then the little eyes would be behaviours, good things, bad things, times you've lied, times you've told the truth, times you've been virtuous and not so virtuous. You populate that big eye with little eyes, and you label them positive, negative. And it shows you within that eye that these things exist within you, and they same as they exist within everybody. So the extension of that is obviously unconditional self-acceptance, but also unconditional other acceptance. If it's true for you, it's true for them, because you're both human beings. You share that. And even though on social media people might seem as if they're successful and perfect and they've got everything they could ever want in the world, for sure there's things that they've got that they're not so happy about, and there's all kinds of ways in which they're letting themselves and other people down, just like you are, just like we all do. That's just being a human being. And I think sometimes that reality is sometimes difficult for people because it can seem negative. That's what it is to be a human being. We are attuned to negativity as a survival imperative. You ask people to name emotions and they start reading off the negatives. And then positives is like relief, happiness, excitement. There's some other stuff there as well, but we are negatively tuned, and that is part of our reality, and it's had to have been for as long as we've existed. So yeah, you do get some bite back on that, because it can seem quite negative to say, well, we are going to fail. But that doesn't make you a complete failure. It just kind of makes you a human being like the rest of us. And I think it's kind of can be potentially an antidote to this modern age that we're in, this digital age, this kind of social media age. Just take some perspective on that and not believe everything that you see, and understand that they're the same as you. They might seem different in all these different ways, and they might have come from a different place, but fundamentally, their brain can't break the laws of physics. There's going to be limitations within everybody,
I guess it's like a modern socialization, like it's a new way of trying to socialize beliefs in people.
Yeah, which is difficult to see the nuance, because the internet age has done away with nuance quite significantly.
Yeah.
Whereas when you walk out into the normal world, when you leave your door, you find out that I'm a bit cold. Oh, I'm a bit hot. you realise that there's all these different ways in which nuance hits you immediately when you leave your house. Yeah.
Well, it's almost like you've seen the slides before mine, because you just give me these wonderful segues into it. Because we've got Daniel's teacher, his sensei, when he was a younger man, And we've got this quote here: never put passion before principle. Even if you win, you lose. Now, I think the etymological root of passion is suffering. So it's like we suffer for our passions. And I think that what this particular quote is trying to sort of demonstrate is when we have these desires that we believe we must have, and we chase them, even if we achieve them, then we're not satisfied with that. Now we have to repeat that. So Ellis spoke about the myth of self-esteem, for instance. So if I have to have positive feedback or praise or adulation, I'm using some examples, but there could be many, to feed my self-esteem, then I'm not really winning, because it doesn't last forever. Just because I won that karate tournament, as we found out with Johnny, he won 2 in a row and then loses a third. Now he's a loser. So we're just reinforcing the fact that I have to keep winning, that I have to keep doing this. And human nature and sort of the natural world suggests that's not going to happen. We're going to lose sometime, or things aren't always going to go to plan. Now, if we build upon that, what Daniels does really well in the Cobra Kai series is he tries to impart that knowledge onto his daughter Sam, who's pictured here. And Sam is very much her father's daughter. So she has a temper, and she can kind of, like anybody, chase that respect that comes from perhaps being a bit feared or being successful. And interestingly, towards the end of Cobra Kai, in a bit of a foreshadowing with Daniel's experiences of kind of wanting respect, she then chooses not to fight. She kind of wakes up in the morning of the competition and goes, actually, she's like, this isn't doing anything for me. It's not serving me. It might even be having a negative effect, and I don't want to do it. And she's kind of a little bit not fearful, but concerned or apprehensive about how her dad's going to react to that. And he's like, that's, you learned this so much quicker than I did, that you can choose and you can exercise that flexibility, and she's very happy and with her choice. And I think that kind of reflects this long-term, we called it long-term hedonism, and we've had this discussion before, Mike, about hedonism might not be the best word, but we'll use it for now. This kind of long-term health, this long-term benefit of rational thinking that Sam kind of really embodies at the end of Cobra Kai.
Yeah, there's a lot in that quote and this particular part, but the root of passion there, partly coming from Stoicism, as you kind of outlined there, but long-term hedonism. So Ellis probably takes hedonism as the Epicureans took hedonism, which isn't pleasure-seeking. It does have more of a long-range idea, hedonism anyway. So I think the true notion of hedonism from an Epicurean sense would be long-term. So in some ways it's a bit of a it does make sense to say long-range hedonism. It's just that hedonism in the modern age has become this kind of pleasure-seeking idea. So I think Ellis felt like he probably had to put long-range in there. So the Epicureans, this idea of hedonism, wasn't necessarily about do the thing that feels the best or chase these positive good feelings. It was more nuanced than I think it's given credit for. Again, any light reading into some of John Sellers' work around Epicureanism, you start to see that. You start to see the what it really means and how it fits with REBT. But also I think, just picking up on some of the pieces that you talked about there, what kind of lights up for me is the idea in Stoicism of virtue. So it's like, don't chase the external thing, chase the internal virtue. The idea would be that your kind of fundamental goals, to use an REBT term, that some of your fundamental goals would be virtuous, to be virtuous. And knowing that you'll never become the sage, perfectly virtuous person, but knowing that by aiming towards virtue and aiming to increase and establish and learn how to be more virtuous, you actually end up being more fulfilled and more content over the long term. And that might mean that you're more successful at work, you have better relationships, you're more successful in hobbies and enjoy them more. Maybe it means that, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, because virtue is its own reward. It's a goal in of itself, the same as we would say rationality is. You try to pursue rationality because it serves you over a long period of time. So this idea of even if you win, you lose, again, like we've said many times so far, it's like, okay, you win, but at what cost? What is the cost of dogmatically and rigidly demanding success and pursuing that at the cost of everything else and sacrificing everything for that trophy, for that money, for that medal, whatever it is? Look, I'm not downplaying the importance of these things for people. Having worked in sport, I'm part of that system. I understand the importance of it, but I would never prize that, or I'd never encourage somebody to prize those external things over and above your long-term contentment and your long-term development as a human being. And I can't think of any downsides to pursuing virtue, to pursuing wisdom, for example, as one of the virtues. I don't see the downside to that, really. So that's what that quote kind of speaks to me, that the whole thing tells me about Stoicism. It tells me about Epicureanism. Obviously, from Mr. Miyagi's perspective, who tries to embody the Eastern philosophy, obviously there's a root there as well. And how we can encourage people to do that, and how the importance of leaders, parents, and significant others in that work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take some notes as we talk. One, because sometimes I want to go back to that one. Secondly, it's for my own kind of benefit, and then thirdly, just to show people sometimes how aligned we are. I even wrote like Sam is virtuous at the bottom of here. This is what I kind of wanted to talk about with this, about how Ellis would be kind of drawing upon like different philosophies and virtue theory, this notion of balance. Sam just perfectly kind of encapsulate that, and I think reflects rationality and rational thinking. Sam fights when she needs to. Like, she's not a coward. So I think sometimes her withdrawal may have been seen as that by some, like, you should fight. Whereas Sam's thinking, I don't need to. So when I need to, I can fight. And, I don't show cowardice. At the same time, fighting when it's unnecessary might be kind of foolhardy, might be the word we might use. So in her instance, she has that kind of perfect middle ground, which we considered virtuous, in alignment with virtue theory of perhaps bravery, we might call that. I mean, I've had a ball talking about REBT, but particularly enjoyed talking about REBT and Karate Kid and Cobra Kai. Can you sense my enthusiasm for this?
I can indeed. This is the happiest I've ever seen you.
It's just such a great show. People need to check it out, even if they don't necessarily want to relate to REBT, although of course they will now.
Of course. Well, yeah, and there's more examples of this, and we'll continue to apply RBT in these ways, whether it's sport, whether it's media. We definitely want to do a music version, don't we, Stu, at some point?
Absolutely. Lots. So, and if you liked this, please feel free to comment and perhaps ask questions around whether it's this particular example, or if there's music or other types of media that you want us to discuss, please do so.
100%. And just as a reminder, thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe and make comments if you want to. We're going to obviously publish this on LinkedIn and X, but we're going to move on to other channels at some point. So please stay with us, and hopefully you keep coming back. We enjoy recording these, and would love to know your ideas of what we can talk about and what we can maybe react to going forward.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.